The Quiet Ledger, a story of small things returning. Ethan first learned about the ledger when he was a boy. It was not a ledger made of leather and ink that adults kept in the old parts of town. It was a quiet kind of ledger, one he felt rather than held. He learned it in the way children learn the weight of their shadow, by noticing the way it follows them, by seeing where it pauses and where it stretches. Ethan grew up on the edge of a town that liked to call itself ordinary. There were modest houses, a bakery whose bell jingled every time a customer went in, a playground with swings that creaked with memory, and a river that carried away leaves and small secrets. His father, a carpenter, taught him to measure twice, cut once, and to be careful with promises. His mother taught him to notice things. The small bruise on a neighbor's fruit, the way rain gathers on an old tin roof, the way people say thank you when they mean it and when they don't. When he was 12, Ethan found a stray dog under the bench at the bus stop. The dog was thin and had a soft, honest face, and Ethan shared his sandwich with it. He brought it home, but his father said no, there was no money, no room, and the dog was too much responsibility. Ethan whispered promises to the dog anyway, promises a boy should not have to make on his own. The next morning, the dog was gone. For weeks Ethan searched, behind the bakery, along the river banks, leaving small pieces of bread and writing come back on folded paper. He never traced the dog to a home, but sometimes, late at night, he would cross the street and find that the bench at the bus stop had been washed clean by rain. He liked to think the rain had taken the soft dog and given it shelter elsewhere. Years slid by. The boy became a young man. The quiet ledger became a habit. He noticed, kept track, and maybe, sometimes, tried to pay something back. At 25, Ethan married Myra. Myra had a laugh like wind through dry grass. It surprised him, delighted him, and sometimes, when she told him a story, it settled like rain in the parched places of his life. She taught kindergarten and brought home drawings with jagged suns and crooked houses. They lived modestly in a small second-floor apartment that looked over the bakery. Each Sunday she baked a small loaf and left it on the window sill with a note, for whoever needs bread. Sometimes neighbors took it. Sometimes passer-by birds took the crumbs. Sometimes no one took it, and the bread went stale. But Myra kept, leaving the bread anyway. The ledger did its quiet work when Ethan fixed a neighbor's leaking roof during a storm. An old woman once brought him a jar of pickled lemons a month later, with a smile made of gratitude and the memory of his hands in her rafters. When a co-worker covered for his late arrival at a crucial meeting, Ethan later stayed late to finish the colleague's work. When that colleague fell ill, the ledger looked like ordinary decency, small acts with no fanfare. But Ethan had the sensation that every small kindness left a mark, like footprints that later helped him find his way home in the snow. It is easier to speak of debts when they are sums of money. It is harder when debts are not coins but moments, favors, phone calls, the giving of an hour to someone who needed to cry. The ledger was not a ledger of balances and interest. It held the texture of days. It recorded how many times someone smiled at another's children. It kept track of how often someone forgave a mistake. It stored the taste of words offered at the right moment. When Myra was 32, a hospital called. It was the kind of call that rearranges a life. Myra had a folding cough for months, something they both thought was only stress or the smell of the bakery working late into the night. But this cough was a stranger wearing familiar clothes. Tests showed a small but stubborn growth in her chest. Surgery was possible. Recovery was uncertain. The whirring became a quiet rain over their apartment. It soaked into furniture and into the silence of their kitchen. Ethan became an apprentice to anxieties he had not known existed. Myra tried to be brave, taught children to paint clouds, ate warm soup, and smiled when she could. Friends helped. Mrs. Alvarez from downstairs brought soup and a soft shawl. Tomas from the bakery gave them leftover bread and specimens of good humor. Their neighbor, Annika, offered rides to the clinic and stayed with Ethan during the long waits. Each small help was a deposit in the ledger. Then there was a day when everything seemed to tip. Complications after surgery left Myra with a long recovery. Costs rose beyond what they had saved, and Ethan found himself working nights at the carpenter shop and days managing small repairs at the bakery to make ends meet. He lived on coffee and memory. Sleep came in shallow rounds. Sometimes he would stand by the window at 3 in the morning and watch the bakery's close sign, thinking about the ledger and how things could go both ways at once. During one of these nights, Ethan noticed a shadow moving along the alley. It was a young man, thin, with a backpack worn in the way of someone who had carried it for many days. Ethan stepped out to see if he needed a hand, and the man said he had nowhere to go. Ethan remembered the bench at the bus stop and the way a boy had once promised a dog a home. He also remembered how many times someone had come to their window with soup. He invited the man inside. He washed up a mug of tea, offered him the small couch that Myra used better days, a nap corner, and let him sleep. The next morning, the young man left a small, crude carving on the windowsill, a wooden bird, burned at the edges. He said nothing else, only bowed as if the world had asked him to be grateful. These things were not grand, they were soft, almost indifferent to their own goodness. They were not the kind of deeds that get put in the front page of newspapers, but the ledger liked them. A little later, a neighbor's daughter, the same child who drew sons crooked and big, saw Ethan lowering himself into the river to rescue a duck caught in some netting. The child told her mother, who told the neighbors. A month later, a group of them organized a small fair to raise money for Myra's follow-up therapy. They sold sandwiches, old crafts, and Myra's spare drawings. The ledger had been fed, and its pages swelled with small gratitude. The ledger does not always reward in ways we expect. It does not say, "Give bread, receive gold." It says, "Give bread, and in time you will have a place to stand." Rewards have their own logic. Sometimes they arrive as an open door, sometimes as the presence of someone who will wait for you, sometimes as a moment of quiet safety. One afternoon, a woman named Lillian came into the bakery with an old suitcase. She was traveling through town and enjoyed the smell of yeast and sugar. She spoke with a voice shaped by many miles. She ordered a loaf and asked for a place to sit. Ethan served her, and she smiled like a person who has been lucky and knows it. They talked about the river, about the small ways of living a modest life, about architecture, and the way a doorframe makes a room look like a promise. When she left, she gave Myra a small card with a name on it. Lillian said, "If you ever need help, call me. I'm working in the city now, and if anyone deserves help, it's someone who gives bread away." It was a small thing. Months later, when Myra needed a specialized therapy far from town, the therapy was expensive and required many sessions. Ethan barely slept for a week, calculating costs with a trembling hand. There were nights when he thought of selling the old carpenter tools he had saved from his father's shed. The ledger hummed with the memory of Lillian's card. Ethan called, and Lillian answered. She listened, and the next sound was the sound of doors opening, help to cover travel, a small fund from a professional network she was part of, a recommendation that found the best specialist at a cut price. The ledger had trusted Ethan's past kindnesses and now returned with a hand to lift. Love, in the ledger's logic, is not an isolated event. It is an array of small, patient acts that accumulate weight. Myra recovered slowly. Her laughter returned like a cautious bird. The therapy changed the contour of their lives, not by removing hardship, but by making it bearable. They kept leaving bread on the windowsill. They kept helping neighbors with shelves and loose floorboards. Some mornings, a bouquet would appear at their door, thrift store flowers, tied with string. Sometimes a neighbor would bring back a borrowed tool with the handle oiled and smooth. The ledger kept score in a soft way. Years passed. Ethan aged with a gentle discipline. He became known not because he ventured into the world to do grand deeds, but because his life was a sequence of small, reliable kindnesses. It was the sort of reputation that creates calm. People trusted him to be there, to listen, to fix a door or bake a small loaf when someone was sick. There came a season when the town was visited by drought. The river that fed the orchards slowed to a thin, hot ribbon, gardens shriveled. The bakery's flour costs rose, and the town's mood soured. People argued more. Fear gives small things sizes they never had. It makes neighbors less patient and less kind. The ledger felt the pressure of this new weather. Its pages rustled like dry leaves. One clear morning, when the heat seemed to make shadows limp, a fire started in the old mill near the river. The mill was an old building that had once produced cloth and held the town's rhythms in its gears. Flames ate at the wood like a hungry story. People gathered, some with water, some with blankets. The bakery's windows fogged with the heat. Ethan found himself standing among others, holding a wet cloth and waiting for instructions. Myra was home, fragile in her recovery but insistent on standing with him. The mill burned long, and it seemed like the town's bones might break. In the confusion, someone shouted that Mr. Patel, an elderly man who lived alone and had once paid Ethan for fixing a broken porch, was still inside. There was a ladder and a young volunteer who rushed in to carry Mr. Patel out. The volunteer stumbled, and a beam cracked, sending the roof downward. Smoke and dust filled the air. Ethan, without thinking, ran in behind the volunteer. A small child had been playing near a window and was coughing. Ethan found him and grabbed him, feeling the child's small, delicate weight. In the smoky red of the fire, Ethan handed the child to a firefighter and pushed another beam aside, making a path. Someone pulled him out just as the roof creaked and collapsed. When he came out, coughing and soot-streaked, he saw the crowd lifting Mr. Patel and the volunteer. The town cheered, small hands clapped. For days, there were murmurs of thanks and concern. People carried water and blankets to those who had lost roofs. The ledger, after days of drought and heat, filled with the weight of human solidarity. But for Ethan, there was a quieter return. One evening, as his hands mended a neighbor's fence, an envelope arrived at his door. Inside was an old photograph of a woman he had once helped many years ago, an elderly woman whose roof he had fixed during a rain-swept night. The photograph had a note, "We never forgot. We owe you." Along with it was a slip that read, "You are invited. There will be a small gift from the town. Please join us Saturday." Ethan was embarrassed. He did not like attention, but he went, because Myra wanted to. At the gathering, people gave simple speeches about being the kind of town where someone would run into a burning mill to save a child. The town presented Ethan with a small key, a key to the community center's library, symbolic but meaningful. Someone had collected money through a discreet jar and gave them enough to put a new roof on a neighbor's house that had been leaking for months. Ethan accepted with a whisper. He felt the ledger opening and closing, like a book that had been read and left on a table. He realized that what the ledger offered was never singular. It created relationships that could be leaned on when storms came. It built a network of care with invisible threads. In the quiet after that summer, Ethan allowed himself an uncommon thought. Maybe the ledger was not a judge. It felt less like a balance sheet and more like weather. Sometimes storms gathered because the ledger needed to move things along. Sometimes rewards arrived late. Sometimes kindness returned as kindness to someone else. On behalf of the original giver, there was no direct arithmetic to it. One winter, there was a knock at the door. A man with a careful face and a pressed coat stood on the step. He introduced himself as Daniel, an architect from the city, someone who had come to town to research old buildings. He had found a note in a library's minutes about a carpenter who had once helped in the town's reconstruction decades earlier. He wanted to hire Ethan to consult on a renovation and offered a contract that would allow Ethan to work occasionally in the city, to get better equipment, and to bring a reliable income to support Myra's art and her lessons. The offer was generous and exactly timed. Ethan wondered if the ledger had arranged it, like a gardener planning for spring. He accepted. The job meant travel and new faces and the slow expansion of possibility. It also meant time apart. Ethan took the work because of necessity and because Myra wanted him to reach beyond their small street. One Sunday, to celebrate, they went further downriver to the bench where, years ago, a boy had promised a dog a home. There, leaving a small loaf on the bench, they looked at each other and said, without dramatic words, that it had been strange to live with the ledger. It made them feel humble and held at once. They understood that lives are woven, and that the fabric does not always know how strong it is until pulled. At times, the ledger returned in ways that startled Ethan. Once, a man came to the bakery and offered Ethan a seat in a community theater production. The man said, "You helped my mother many years ago, when we were poor and fearful. You fixed our door, and you taught me the courage to ask for help. I want to give you a part in the play." Ethan, who had never acted, found himself learning lines and standing on a stage, feeling the strange generosity of being given a role that had no practical return and yet made his nights brighter. The ledger had a sense of humor. It liked to answer kindness with opportunities that fed the soul. Not all returns were gentle. There were seasons when the ledger delivered misfortune to those who had harmed others, but it did so in ways that did not satisfy the desire for revenge. A trader who had cheated customers lost a shipment to the rain, and then his business dwindled in reputation. But he later mended his practices and later in life taught his son to be honest, and the son became a kind man. The ledger seemed to understand that punishment without transformation was insufficient. It aimed to make people face their choices and, perhaps, learn. Ethan lived to an age where his hands grew slower, where the woody cut required more patience. Myra's hair threaded with silver, and she still laughed when children gave her drawings. Their apartment was the same, filled with small things, soft chairs, a bookshelf of mismatched novels, a window that still held a loaf on Sundays. They had no great wealth. They had friends, neighbors, and a river that sometimes remembered to be generous with rain. One morning, sitting on the community center's library bench, Ethan met a timid young woman named Noah. She had lost a job and did not know how to rebuild her routine. She had a habit of looking at the ground, as if the world might fall. Ethan sat beside her and offered a slow, patient conversation. He taught her how to mend a small stool and how to listen to the wood's grain. He did not lecture. He simply showed the practical rhythm of a craft and invited her to come by on afternoons. Nora began to come. She learned to whittle, found work at a small carpenter's workshop, and later taught children to carve birds from scraps. When Noah returned years later, she brought a small journal, full of names of people she had helped, the list like a map of kindness. She told Ethan that she had been helped by someone else years ago and wanted to keep track so that she might one day return it. Ethan smiled and said, "The ledger does not demand that you account for every kindness. It simply asks that you keep living so that others can be saved by your small acts." On his last winter, Ethan grew quiet. He thought of ledgers not as final judgments, but as stories that trace the ways we touch others. The ledger does not punish or reward in the single sense that we imagine. It simply shows us how things reappear. Sometimes kindness comes back to the person who did it. Sometimes it returns as a chain of kindness given to someone else. Sometimes it returns in the joy of a child who learns to carve a bird. Ethan understood, finally, that the ledger was less about outcomes and more about orientation. It taught a person to keep an inner compass that pointed toward generosity and patience. The ledger did not guarantee a painless life. It did not promise that we would never feel grief or fear. It promised that our actions matter in the weave of life, that small, steady goodness contributes to the fabric of our world. On a day when the river had thawed and the sun was a pale coin in the sky, Ethan walked to the bakery with Myra and bought a small loaf. They walked to the bench near the river where he had once promised a dog a home. They sat with the loaf between them and watched a child chase a bird along the bank. Children are language makers. They name things and make the world feel new. Ethan placed the loaf on the bench and, without ceremony, said a quiet thanks, not to any ledger that tallied for him, but to the pattern that had allowed him to belong to a sequence of human care. Myra squeezed his hand. They did not know how the ledger would write their last pages, only that every small act had left a mark bigger than either of them. When Ethan died, the town remembered him with a silence that fit him, not loud, but full. People told stories of his hands, the warmth of his bread, the patient way he taught others to carve. Some people who had been helped by him in small ways organized a communal book of stories and readings. Myra read, voice steady, telling a story she had tucked into her pocket for years, the story of the boy who gave a sandwich to a dog and the chain of people who followed. At the funeral, Mr. Patel, the man saved from the mill, stood and said, "We were once saved by this town, and one man of that town was Ethan. He taught us to be bridges for each other." Others mentioned small things, a scarf found on a cold morning, a shelf fixed so a child could sleep safely. These were not the big, ringing successes life sometimes prizes. They were the hum of life. The ledger had recorded them, and now the town spoke them aloud. After the funeral, Myra found a small note hidden in Ethan's toolbox. It read, in his neat, patient hand, "Live so that your small acts can travel. Leave whispers of kindness behind. Do not fear that good will be stolen. It grows in other hands." No one could say how long the ledger would keep working. It was not a magic machine. It was a reminder, a practice in the world. It asked people to keep noticing, to keep being small lights, to remember that every choice plants roots somewhere. In the years that followed, the bench with the loaf remained. People still left small loaves sometimes, or folded papers with notes, or little carved birds. Children learned to fix things with help from those who had learned before them. The town stitched itself in a slow, human way that carried them through droughts and fires and seasons of quiet. And so the ledger continued, patient and unglamorous, a quiet account that measured how people treated one another. It did not promise rewards on demand. It did not promise a life without pain. But it offered a subtle truth, that our smallest acts ripple on, and that to live with care is to help the world bend towards something like mercy. Lesson learned. The story of Ethan and the quiet ledger teaches that the principle of karma, of actions returning in some form, is not a simple equation of reward and punishment. Rather, it is an orientation, a way of living that values small, consistent acts of kindness, patience, and responsibility. These small acts build relationships, networks of care, and resilience that we may one day need. The ledger does not guarantee immediate or direct returns. It often works through indirect, delayed, or transformed ways, sometimes giving back as opportunity, sometimes as help through others, and sometimes as the quiet knowledge that one's life has meaning. Live with awareness of your acts. Be generous in small ways. Keep faith that those actions matter in the weave of human life. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart, please take a moment to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you won't miss the next story that may change the way you see life.